What does it mean to embody Mario? Presumably, at a base level, Mario completes each of the stages, saves Princess Peach, and gets cucked. When you play a Mario game, if you, as the player, accomplish all these things, you are embodying the character. But is there more to consider? In what fashion does Mario do these things? Does he get hit? Does he go out of his way to collect as many coins as he can? Does he kill all the enemies he meets? Does he finish quickly? Does he die? If you've played the original Super Mario Bros., you might agree it's pretty easy to ignore the score system entirely and conceptualize the goal of the game as merely saving Princess Peach. Nevertheless, the score is a combination of coins and power-ups collected, enemies chained, bricks broken, and remaining time. You ideally want these numbers at the top of the screen to be as high as possible when you finish a stage. These are the incentives in Super Mario besides completion. Does this imply that to embody Mario is to kill everything you see, break every brick you can, collect every coin, collect every power-up even when you don't need them, and jump to the top of the flagpole as quickly as possible? Perhaps, but is there anything besides the numerical incentive to reinforce this idea? I'd say no. I doubt many of us conceptualize Mario as a hyper-efficient Minecraftian killing machine with his eye forever on the bag, although the game is incentivizing you to realize Mario as such. What does it mean to embody Sonic? The answer is a lot more obvious. However, replace coins for rings, and the original Sonic shares basically all the same incentives as Super Mario. Sonic is a hyper-efficient freeing machine with a boundless appetite for Cheerios. They're great. No, I don't eat cereal. Also, he bounces on stuff. That gives points too. While it's just as easy to ignore the score in early Sonic games, there is probably one category you're more likely to pay attention to. Completion time. Sonic has gotta go fast. This clarity is down to a confluence of factors, but I'd hazard a guess that the strongest factor is context, characterization. I mean, Mario's also a momentum-based platformer, so why doesn't the same logic apply? Since the character's conception, speed has been at the center of Sonic's character.
Wow, Sonic's fast!
Even though the early games didn't feature cutscenes nor text scrolls to establish this, supplemental materials such as the manual, the promotional rap songs, the marketing in general, all underlined speed as this rodent's defining characteristic.
Come on, just show me what you got. Going fast is cool, going slow is
cringe.
The game itself mostly relied on his name, his design, I guess, and animation to get this across. There's the famous idle animation that characterized him as impatient, and there was the running animation when the player reached a high enough speed, the mere existence of which implied that this speed was an ideal to aim for. In later games, you get cutscenes, a more vivid interpretation of who Sonic is and how he looks when he's doing his thing. This characterization provides a clear aesthetic for the player to aim for, a standard to meet. It is not enough to complete the level, you're supposed to do it fast. If you don't do it fast, you're not embodying the character. But why is embodying the character important? Well, because a character's actions, your actions in the case of a game, serve as characterization. And if your actions in gameplay constitute a character that is in conflict with what the game presents outside of gameplay, you've got a problem. What I'm talking about here, of course, is ludonarrative dissonance. Yeah! You're watching a video about gaming on YouTube, so you know what it means, but my mom watches these and, I bet even she knows what it means by this point. Mom?
Yes?
What is ludonarrative dissonance?
When gameplay is in conflict with the story.
No.
What?
You've all heard of 2013's Tomb Raider, where Lara's characterization in cutscenes clashes with how the player is expected to embody her in gameplay. Press L3 to show remorse? That just switches the camera. This is merely an example of a game not considering how its story and gameplay came together. A decade on and developers are still making the same mistake. But ludonarrative dissonance can be achieved quite easily in other ways. One of, if not the defining aspect of games, is player input. The player is afforded some control over the visual output, so in many games, dissonance can often occur whenever the player wants it to. I recently played Soma. Now, this is distinct from ludonarrative dissonance as we generally understand it. Typically, when leveraged as a criticism, ludonarrative dissonance refers to an incongruity between the context and the intent of the game design. What does the game intend you to do versus what the story is telling us? This is player-driven, an inevitable possibility thanks to the interactivity of the medium. But it is still an incongruity in the narrative. To minimize the potential for this dissonance, developers can take measures to align character interests and ability with those of the player. The game may be an RPG, where your input defines your character as you play and the story accommodates. You might play as a marble. Or you might have a Mario. He's a character, he has traits, he's helpful, and he likes to do things. So as a player, basically anything goes. He is essentially an everyman that accommodates a wide variety of player input while remaining narratively consistent to whatever sliver of a narrative there is. Would Mario do this? This is a well-chosen archetype for the medium. While there are incentives for the based gamer to kill every enemy and nab every coin and do it as quickly as possible, there's no narrative downside to ignoring these incentives and just engaging with the game at a base level, or prioritizing whatever you want. Which is good. Mario is meant to be accessible. But Sonic is a different beast entirely. He's a hedgehog, apparently. Most Sonic games shirk their accessibility and lean into this potential for dissonance to use it as an incentive. And this is the design ethic that I want to discuss. At least at first, this video kind of goes places. To play Sonic is to go fast, but that's easier said than done. To play Dante is to be stylish, but that's easier said than done. To play 47 is to drop the chandelier on a bitch, but I don't know how to do that. And to play Viola, we'll get to Viola. These characters posit an aesthetic ideal, how you'd imagine the character would perform without the player's influence. And a big part of these characters' aesthetic is exceptionally competent. Unreasonably competent, really. Consequently, realizing the aesthetic ideals of these characters in gameplay requires more than entry-level skill. It requires some level of mastery, an intimate understanding of their respective games. As such, the first playthrough of these titles are likely to be rife with ludonarrative dissonance despite the player's best efforts. This is the cost of this design ethic. Instead of a Mario that accommodates a range of player skill, instead of the RPG character that offers themselves to the player's whims so the two can immediately be aligned in intent and execution, these characters require you to align yourself with them. That is ultimately the challenge of these games, and it can be a bit of a hazing process before the player produces any satisfying output. How was I supposed to know to jump there? I can't see that coming from this perspective, but Sonic can. It's in front of him. Where the fuck are you going? It's why titles with this design ethic tend to be more niche, because a vast majority of gamers are fucking pussy. Impatient, entitled, stupid children have better things to do with their time. But I don't. I think the reason this design ethic appeals to me so much is because it rewards the committed player with an increasingly fitting aesthetic and narrative output. Your reward for your dedication and mastery is Dante acting like Dante. He remains in character. I don't know, I just find that to be very compelling. And funnily enough, games with everyman characters run the risk of having the opposite effect. Look at this absolute beast play Mario. It's impressive as all hell, but is that Mario? Keeping the character and context in mind, thin as they may be, this visual output can almost be comical. Why can the plumber do these things? This is an everyman? I'm fucked. Damn, this farm boy is really just bodying Satan, huh? No damage, is that right? Whereas you watch a Code IT video exhibiting an ungodly level of skill and understanding and you're like, yeah, that's Dante. You watch a Werster video and you're like, yeah, that's Sonic. There is a powerful intrinsic drive to strive for excellence in these games. The drive to faithfully realize the character, because unlike many other games, it's not something you can just do, even upon completion. And this drive can keep you invested for a perfectly healthy amount of time. In fact, this drive can be so powerful it can even outweigh whatever extrinsic incentives the game entices you with. It's likely one of the reasons you probably don't care about your score in early Sonic games past the speed component. If you have a playthrough of Sonic walking slowly, stopping to tap his foot, and getting hit a bunch, you don't need a bad score to tell you something's wrong. You are producing footage of Sonic that is obviously not canon, as it were. Hell, the idle animation may break the fourth wall to imply precisely that. If he were in control, Sonic wouldn't do these things. Even when you get moderately good, if you flub something even slightly, you can just see it. You see how the run should have gone. You see how Sonic would have done it. And you die a little inside. You know, if Dante were in control, he wouldn't just miss all these attacks. It simply looks wrong. That's annoying, so you want to strive to be better. Now, this dynamic is present to an extent in most, if not all, action games. You know, I'm sure Mario doesn't die on his way to another castle. But what separates these games from the rest is that they promote excellence through their characterization. Unreasonable competence. They push players to reach the height of what is capable in their games through their context, whereas many games choose rather to accommodate the player as soon as possible. Now, I said the intrinsic drive to embody the character can override the extrinsic incentives, but ideally they should be working in harmony. And ultimately, I'd say the extrinsic incentives actually matter more. Whereas intrinsic incentives are largely subjective, because characterization is ultimately suggestive, and what you are compelled to do in a space is as much down to you as the space itself, the extrinsic incentives are objective. There is a definite way to attain the highest possible score in a Sonic game. Ideally, that way should equate to a fitting visual output, right? A run where the player disappears and all you see is Sonic running through the level as Sonic would. Because why not, right? You have an established character in a scenario. There is potential for the player to embody that character in this scenario as they have been established outside it. Why wouldn't the incentives aim for precisely that? So that the output of the game, the visual narrative throughout cutscenes and gameplay, is consistent. Why would the character be established as such if they were destined to be at odds with the gameplay? Why do I have to break every fucking bench in Fortuna Castle? Why would Dante do that? As such, an important consideration when designing games like this is to align the extrinsic incentives with the character as closely as possible. To perform an accurate mechanical interpretation of the character, as it were, or a character interpretation of the mechanics. Incentivize the player to embody them, or change the context to better suit the mechanics. And of course, have that system equate to a fun experience. That's always nice. The early Sonic games, as I alluded to earlier, don't do very well in this regard. As I said, you're rewarded for completion speed, ring count, and enemies killed, or rather, enemies and interactables chained. These incentives can be at odds with each other, and optimal play is centered around killing yourself. I'm not actually joking. Your score doesn't reset when you die. Why was this a trend? Even in the arcade days, this didn't make sense. If you aren't feeling suicidal, but want to get a high score, either you find a middle ground for each particular stage, or recognize when the yield from one category can outweigh that of the others. I'd argue the former is functional in regards to maintaining a consistent character, but the latter isn't. In Green Hill 2, you want the 50,000 point bonus for beating the level in under 30 seconds, while chaining enemies and picking up as many rings as you can afford. In Green Hill 3, you want to forget speed altogether to rack up an insane plus 16 enemy combo that begins to yield 10,000 points per hit. The system, as implemented in the game, does not lend itself to a consistent experience, nor a consistent character. Sonic is letting cute little bunnies remain trapped as he runs past them 1 minute, only to all of a sudden care about saving every last one the next minute. Do you want to go fast, or do you want to help people, Sonic? The platonic ideal of Sonic would presumably do both at the same time, but these games don't accommodate that. I guess you could argue he's got ADHD, that could be consistent. And it's not to say these incentives can't work in harmony. Sonic Unleashed is an example where the formula yields a far more consistent result because of how the boost system works. Boosting expends a resource to move Sonic at high speed. You build your resource by collecting rings and killing enemies. And boosting absorbs rings and kills enemies. So as you can see, collecting rings and killing enemies are both instrumental and incidental to speed in this case. All of the incentives are combined around the singular goal of going fast. You know, this game is really cool. Half of this game is really cool. I don't have an Xbox, please remaster this already. The early games made attempts at this. There's the mechanic of bouncing off enemies to maintain speed. Killing enemies is instrumental to speed in this case. There's the fact that ball form, the fastest state Sonic can be in, acts as an attack. Killing enemies is incidental to speed in this case. However, the former doesn't factor into gameplay that much throughout the game, neither account for the enemies you roll past, and both are undermined entirely when the best approach objectively is to disregard speed, as is the case in Green Hill 2. Points for trying though, this was still quite early. You know, Spagonia wasn't built in a day. That's what they called Italy. Yo, do you remember the Roman Empire? But enough about old Sonic and Boost Sonic. I want to talk peak Sonic. What I really want to talk about is Sonic Advance 3 is an incredibly clean example of a game aligning its extrinsic incentives with the character, and that's mostly down to simplicity. Can you believe that out of basically every Sonic game, Sonic Advance 3 is like the only one that exclusively incentivizes speed? SA3 ditches score altogether, and appropriately, badniks no longer contain animals to save, so there's no narrative tension in running past them. The aesthetic ideal of Sonic here is very simple. He goes fast. That's basically the only aspect of his character we're concerned with here. And I don't think you can get a more airtight extrinsic incentive structure than a single numerical value. There's no equation here, just a single value that accurately and unforgivingly reflects how Sonic your run was. You want to go fast as Sonic, and this game pushes you only to go fast as Amy's here too. I like Amy. Sonic Frontiers cyberspace levels are also strong in this regard, but like, what are these numbers when you kill enemies? There's no score. Where are these numbers going? What is this? However, there is an issue that can arise from having the extrinsic incentive be so simple, and that is, the game has a harder time ensuring that that incentive leads to the aesthetic ideal of the character, and that there's no other way to satisfy that requirement. Sonic Advance 3 does pretty well in this regard. It is the tits. Play it. But cyberspace has some stuff. I hate this. It is faster to spam the side dash into a wall than to just run forward. It looks really dumb. Why is the game rewarding me for banging my head into a wall? Why must Sonic suffer for his art? In this regard, it's a good thing that Sonic Unleashed factored rings and enemies into the score. Otherwise, top-tier Unleashed gameplay would be this. Yeah, I don't think that's what Sonic would do. Thankfully, the requirements for an S rank in Unleashed keep you on track, maintaining a visual output that mostly looks exceedingly Sonic. Wait, that's a thing here too? Another more prevalent issue throughout the series, one my darling Advance 3 does unfortunately fall subject to, is the fact that sometimes it is faster to take damage than avoid it. I also hate this. I don't like seeing Sonic get hit. He wouldn't do that. He's perfect. It looks bad. He's flashing. That's obviously not canon. Yet SA3 and Frontiers incentivize it. Or at least don't incentivize against it. Whereas if the score accounted for how many rings you had, it wouldn't be an option. To paraphrase a point from Matthew Matosis's Beautiful Joe commentary, watch it, seriously watch it. When developers ask players to fulfill a single requirement, things might fall through the cracks. There may be exploits the devs hadn't caught that would allow the player to undermine the intended experience. Introducing a more robust ranking system, giving the player more priorities, would mean things would need to fall through multiple independent cracks, which is far less likely. So there are negatives to having so few variables. You're putting all your eggs in one basket, as it were, so you gotta make damn sure you've got a good basket. However, more complex systems have issues of their own. Devil May Cry 5 features a scoring system with far more variables than Sonic. Dante fights competently and stylishly. Okay, style. That is a hard thing to quantify. But the game does a commendable job in breaking it down through its style system. Make sure your attacks connect. Vary your attacks. You want the visual output to resemble a fight from an action movie, and you tend not to see people spam the same animation, as it were, so that makes sense. Avoid damage and preferably do so at the last second. Sure. And don't go too long without performing a relevant action, be it an attack, a parry, a guard, a dodge, or a taunt. And oh yeah, taunt. It lets the character's personality come through. This is a well-considered system, an apt mechanical interpretation of fighting stylishly, and from a gameplay perspective, none of these incentives are much at odds with one another, but man, that's a lot of variables. It does a good job of incentivizing players towards a correct style of play, but it can only take you so far. There is a clear distinction between stylish and unstylish. One could say it's objective, but there's a much hazier distinction between stylish and more stylish, and that distinction only gets hazier the further up the ladder you go. You stray further from the realm of objectivity and start entering that of personal taste, and as such, the score cannot accurately account for the extent to which you are embodying the character at higher levels of competency. My conception of style, my conception of Dante, is a little different than yours. Mine's a virgin, and that's how I play. From my experience, I've had runs I would consider dope as all hell that scored lower than runs I would consider decent. To the game's credit though, I'd say the score remains accurate, or rather useful, until around the highest honors the game can give you, the S rank. In math class, you may have had to come up with an equation. You know what the output should be for whatever variables you insert, and then you think you found it, so you run the tests. X outputs Y, as it should. Y outputs Z, as it should. Z outputs A, as it should, but then A outputs Q, and that's not supposed to happen. You don't actually have the right equation. It only worked for a couple of values. 99.999% of the time, it won't work. However, this equation may as well be right if the only variables you'll ever input are X, Y, and Z. That is the style system of DMC, an imperfect equation that is useful up until a point, and the game stops grading you past that point. To get into the minutiae of it a bit, the Royal Guard ability breaks the vary your attacks rule, likely because it's such a high-risk maneuver that arguably gets riskier the more you use it. If a player can perfectly block a whole string of different attacks, it feels odd not to reward them for it past the first block. As such, you can spam Royal Guard and maximize your score without even spending enemy health to do so. Also, the developers had to be reasonable with how many different attacks you have to perform after using attack A before using it again can net you the maximum amount of points. This means the system can't distinguish between a player who is varying their moves to the minimum extent and a player varying their moves to the maximum extent. There's also the no damage bonus that doubles your score that might net a player adopting safer, less stylish strategies flawlessly more points than a player taking more risks and being more stylish, but with a fuck up here or there. All this to say, there are issues. The system can work perfectly fine for a player who adopts the philosophy of the game, play efficiently and stylishly, but when scrutinized, elements of the system can absolutely be exploited. This is the weakness of having so many variables. It's simply hard to create an equation that accounts for the particulars of each variable and balances them all appropriately. It's hard to keep things consistent as values scale, not to mention it's hard if not impossible to make a solid equation to account for something that's even partly subjective. It's impressive the DMC has a system that functions to this extent, and the developers addressed the limitations of their system excellently. As mentioned before, they kept the score system around only as far as it was useful, to merely push the player past a certain threshold. They also framed their incentives in a way to disencourage taking the system too seriously. You do not have a point readout during the action. Rather, you have this vague style meter that just tells you whether or not you're on the right track. Your score multiplier cannot increase infinitely. You will cap out. These touches relieve some of the pressure to strictly play to the system, to really maximize your score. It minimizes the incentive to exploit any unbalanced aspects and overall incentivizes a more varied and expressive player experience. And that ultimately translates to a character that is having fun being stylish more so than playing strictly to the incentive structure would. This is the key to how DMC5 leveraged its imperfect system so successfully. The score system is utilized more to get the player to adopt the right mindset than act as the end-all be-all of the player's performance. The style meter just makes sure you're in the ballpark of who Dante is objectively and lets you realize the particulars from there. This is a segue. Framing is important. It's not just the incentives, but how they are communicated. Sonic Advance 3 is as simple and strict as it can get. If your time is lower, that is reflective of a run that is more accurately Sonic, barring a glitch or two here or there and taking damage. Why must Sonic suffer for his art? DMC5 comes off as more wishy-washy. I have scored higher than Code IT's run against Virgil but his run feels far more like Dante than mine. His run is much more stylish than mine. DMC5 cuts the incongruity by deeming both S rank runs. Forget the points. They're small. Look at this big, shiny golden S. Surely this should be what you're more concerned with. Comparing the two runs and saying they're both S-rank runs is a lot more agreeable than saying one run is objectively better than the other because it scored higher points. Sonic Advance 3 also has a medal system, but the mode you'll play most is probably Time Attack. It's essentially the level select of the game. It's the easiest way to access levels and change characters on the fly. Obviously, in Time Attack, time is of utmost importance, and you're treated to a special jingle and dance when attaining a new best time. This is important. Even if you passed the threshold for a gold medal runs and runs ago, the game will emphatically reward you for shaving 0.1 seconds off your best time. This reads that scoring higher, being faster, is still emphasized by the game past the gold medal. To compare, all you'll get for attaining a new high score in DMC5 is that this little number will get higher. Yes, I am talking about the size and the shininess and the fucking songs and dances involved with representing your score. They have a marked effect and carry different implications. Recently, at time of writing at least, I've come upon an excellent example of the power of framing. But it will take us on some tangents. It's time to talk about Bayonetta. No, not that Bayonetta, I mean the real Bayonetta. Why? Viola is the new addition to the Bayonetta franchise. She's brash, she's got heart, she's got spunk, she's got an incredible drive to prove herself as competent. But she's unskilled, she's clumsy, she's unrefined. However, the score system established for Bayonetta was not altered at all to account for her character. Mommy Bayonetta is an effortlessly efficient, hyper-competent, straight-up deicidal badass. The high-class kind of gal that headbutts any skyscraper thrown at her. That is a thing, by the way, if you haven't played. Play it. Mother's score system...
My what?
No, not you. ...is broken into 3 categories. Time, combo score, and damage taken. You are incentivized to finish each encounter quickly while consistently dealing damage, varying your attacks. I said varying your attacks, Bayonetta 2, and not getting hit. That's what earns you the coveted pure platinum. Viola is not that character. Frequently, she fumbles the bag, misses, gets hit. In fact, I don't think she is ever portrayed as competent in any way outside of gameplay. Wait, no, there's one instance. She dodges the mole a couple times. As such, we run into the Mario problem where ludonarrative dissonance may occur when you're playing really well, and that's just kind of weird. The characterization of these characters doesn't accommodate high levels of play. Really. Viola is flawlessly fighting her way through every encounter. Viola is beating the polymerized darkness within infinite Bayonetta's hearts without getting hit. I don't believe you. If you've played Bayo 3, I'm sure you can relate to this. The time when you felt most aligned with Viola in terms of intention and execution. One of the most endearing moments for her character. You were trying to play well, trying to look cool, but some stupid jellyfish blindsided you unannounced from off screen and Viola said, "Bullshit!" I'm sure a good number of you said this at the exact same time as her. Although that's neither here nor there. But this moment is fitting. This is the player being in line with the character, and the character performing as expected. Funnily enough, getting hit is an instance of ludonarrative harmony. But if you follow the extrinsic incentives and hypothetically succeed without practice, you'll never even get to hear this line. Now, you may think I'm arguing for the game to incentivize you getting hit. No. Well, kind of. I need to do more setup. Moving on, Chai is the main character of Hi-Fi Rush. Play it! The only good single-player Xbox game since... He's incredibly similar to Viola in terms of characterization. He's brash, he's got heart, he's got spunk, he's got an incredible drive to... Well, not to prove himself, he already thinks he's the shit. He just wants to flex that. But he's unskilled, he's clumsy, and he doesn't even play guitar. His score system is also broken up into 3 categories: completion speed, combo score, and, since Hi-Fi Rush has a rhythmic component, staying on beat. Damage is not a category. It's disincentivized, but you can take a hit, or like 20, while still earning an S rank. And that just makes sense for his character, right? You also only need to get an S in 2 of the 3 categories and an A in the 3rd to achieve the highest rank. Again, fitting. He, like Viola, is not the type to flawlessly dominate every single enemy. The game tells us this, but he will at least rock the fuck out, remain in rhythm, and prevail in the end. It feels like Hi-Fi's ranking system rewards you for embodying the character, whereas Viola's rewards you only for surpassing what you would expect of her character. But the question at hand is, fucking so? If I can achieve perfection with these characters, why wouldn't I? And yeah, I've been talking a lot about the intrinsic incentive to embody the character you're playing, but of course there's always the intrinsic incentive to just play well, and that's usually the stronger of the two. Especially in spectacle fighters, you want to achieve the spectacle, Viola or not. Naturally, players strive for competence. Ludonarrative resonance with the character, that's on the developers to facilitate. Ideally, it should be an incidental consequence of playing. I hold Dante, Bayo, and King Arthur in such high regard because this notion holds true for them. They are basically embodiments of the player playing as well as possible and having fun doing so. In the case of these characters, those 2 incentives, embody the character and play well, are one and the same. It's very clean. For the most part, the better you play, the more you embody the character. But when you have a character like Chai or Viola in a stylish action game, the two are separated to some extent. And as such, the game now has to choose what it wants to prioritize. Do you want the player to play well, or do you want to encourage a consistent ludonarrative? Of course, you probably want the player to play well first and foremost. And this is why I brought up framing. Yay, we got here finally. Hi-Fi actually asks more from the player than Bayonetta does, but it simply doesn't come off that way. If you complete a fight without getting hit, you get a star. This itsy bitsy whittle star over here. There is incentive to not get hit as Chai, but it doesn't factor into the big letter grade. It's evidently considered differently than the core requirements of combo, rhythm, and speed. If you come up short in any of these categories, the game tells you, you got a B, evidently you can do better. But there's no star silhouette if you get hit to remind you that this is a category you failed at. It doesn't feel like the game expects this of you. There's also the Royal S rank, a secret rank that can only be achieved at the end of a level if you achieved an S in every category for every fight. Again, I don't get the impression that I'm expected to reach this standard. It's merely there for me to reach if I wish. The game is having its cake and eating it too thanks to its framing, how it's communicating its incentives. It rewards the player far more emphatically merely for embodying the character, reaching some standard that seems appropriate for Chai, but has additional rewards for the dedicated player that strives for perfection. Anyone so inclined knows, the actual goal of Hi-Fi is a starred Royal S rank, but these modifiers to the S feel like modifiers, at least to me. It doesn't feel like the game expects Chai, expects me to reach this standard, but it will absolutely reward me for doing so. DMC5 also does something similar, where the player receives the no damage bonus that doubles their score, but the S rank is balanced around a run in which the player can take damage. Now, I don't know the rationale behind these decisions. If I had to guess, it's more so about not setting unreasonable expectations that may push players away, but I think it does make sense to read it as a distinction between reaching a standard that's appropriate for the character and doing as well as one can possibly do. It just checks out in my eyes, and as we'll see with Bayonetta, I think there is support for this reading. Now, on paper, Bayonetta has basically the exact same incentive and reward structure. In fact, I think Bayonetta attempts to do the same thing as Hi-Fi in this regard, but it doesn't play the same trick on my brain. I think the intent is that a platinum trophy is awarded for embodying the character. That's why the trophy is of the character.
I should have been a pole dancer.
Yeah, me too. These characters aren't perfect. They're just very, 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 very good. A pure platinum is the Bayo equivalent of an S with a little star next to it. You met the requirements and went above and beyond. But it doesn't hit that way, man! I want the cooler trophy. It's purely subjective, but actually, no, fuck that. No, I will dismantle this with facts and logic. There is an objective flaw in the framing of Bayonetta's incentives. If we look at the score breakdown, at the end of each fight, you're rewarded a medal for each category, and those average together to constitute your overall rank for that fight. You can only achieve a platinum medal because you didn't meet one of the requirements as the character would have. Why is Rodin's face there? I am Viola. B-I-O. It just goes to show how much of an effect the littlest differences in framing can have on my suggestive idiot brain. Naturally, how I perceive the game's expectations contributes to how I perceive the characters. This is how you want me to control them, right? This is who they're supposed to be? Despite whatever the game's intent was with platinums and pure platinums, I see Bayonetta as basically perfect, more so than Dante, because that's what I feel the game expects. And that expectation mostly tracks with how she's portrayed outside of gameplay. The same cannot be said for Viola though, and that's what made her so jarring to me. The point I was trying to underline though with the hi-fi comparison, I hope it came across, is that the game could have had the exact same incentives, but if they merely framed them differently, such as hi-fi did, it could have changed my perception of the game's expectations, thus changing how Viola landed for me. Framing is a powerful thing, but of course it's hard to come up with any standards because so much of the effect of framing is down to how the player perceives it. I'm sure some people see no difference here, and on an objective level, there really isn't. For some playing Hi-Fi Rush, an S rank is not satisfactory. It must be a starred purple royal S. Alternatively, I don't need a pure platinum, I got a platinum trophy. That's the best medal. But the fact that I note a severe difference in how I felt should mean others will too, regardless of what that difference is. I guess all I can say is that framing is important. Yeah, developers should consider what the game's expectations should be, how those expectations should be communicated, and consider how said communication may affect the player's experience. How can your framing be read? What are the most likely interpretations? And how will those interpretations incentivize the player to play? This is a segue! I think it's interesting that of the series I've mentioned, Sonic, DMC, Bayonetta, even though each of their respective protagonists is the perfect fit for their series, they've gone on to add additional characters that aren't. You've got your Shadow, your Virgil, your Jean, who are more or less perfect analogs for the originals. You've also got your Tails, your Neros, and your Violas. These characters do not have the benefit of being analogous to competency like their forerunners, and I think the developers now have a greater challenge reconciling that discrepancy in the game design, if they're so inclined to do so. However, when it comes to embodying them, they are far more accessible. Instead of a blank slate RPG character whom you define as you play, or a silent everyman that accounts for many approaches and skill levels, or an ideal to strive towards, these characters' characteristics naturally offer themselves to your average gamer who's playing for the first time. One prominent characteristic they all share is that they want to do well, likely more so than they are able to do well, as the player presumably does. They are depicted as making mistakes, or at least not living up to the standard of the OGs, as a new player presumably will. You are immediately aligned in these regards. It hit me quite hard when playing Hi-Fi. In the stylish action spectacle fighter genre, I'm used to taking my licks before realizing the character in gameplay. But in this case, I was Chai. Chai was Chai, as soon as I stepped in his shoes. This is an interesting archetype of character, and while I don't think it's as neat as the preceding archetype, it doesn't scale as well with player competence, it certainly has its strengths, and a game can use them to great effect. To fillet DMC5 once more,
not for the last time,
it seems a natural choice to start the player off with Nero. More than that, a crippled Nero. Mistakes are accounted for by the story to some degree. A new player is eased in with a character they're more aligned with in intent and execution before they get hit with the Dante drop where it feels a lot more incongruous to fumble the execution. Also, as a quick aside, out of all these characters, I think Nero in 5 is the best handled because the game pulled out quite a lot of stops to ensure he still scales with player competence and it doesn't feel incongruous. Firstly, it didn't portray him anywhere near as incompetent as Viola. Secondly, it ensured that it placed him in scenarios where perfection is plausible. He's always up against far weaker enemies than Dante. Virgil's really tired here. And the 2 times he isn't, the game goes out of its way to give you a non-canon ending to say it's cool you did that with Nero, but no. And thirdly, there's the fact that his capabilities vastly increase after the first playthrough, placing all concurrent playthroughs in that familiar, stylish action state of quasi-non-canon-dom, where the character uses weapons and abilities they didn't have at the time, but in a way they would if they did have them. Overall, despite his depiction as less skilled than Dante, he's still able to scale convincingly with player competency. It makes sense that Nero couldn't perform perfectly in his fights, but it also makes sense that he did. As for DMC4, you can't tell me he didn't get hit here. There's no telegraph on that fucking shotgun when it comes to Viola. I do like Viola. By the way, have you heard her spell her name in the Japanese dub? Yeah, it was probably best to give her a new one. We'll see where the series takes her, if anywhere, but I think it's fair to say I look forward to getting her naked. I'm sure she'll make Mummy proud. So, in summation, I've just been free associating through a stream of vaguely related topics. Thanks for accompanying me. Mum, I just noticed, while going through my Sonic Awakening last year, that I felt a similar drive that I felt with DMC. When I got hit or fumbled a segment, I had the familiar pang independent of my annoyance at performing poorly. I jeopardized the visual output. I messed up embodying Sonic. It's a different feeling to failing or dying. It's more akin to having your immersion broken by bad acting, which essentially is what it is. I could go on to complete the level, but even then I would be pulled back for another try, to see how Sonic would do it. To achieve the canon run, as it were. Until I found out that my routing was suboptimal anyway. I think Sonic, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, and other games of that ilk have a brilliant approach to characterization that, rather than playing to the fundamentals of the medium, exploit the fundamentals of the medium. The developers are not trying to avoid ludonarrative dissonance. They are weaponizing it to motivate you. The developers are not trying to achieve inherent ludonarrative harmony. Rather, they are reserving it as a reward for the highest levels of play, culminating in a ludonarrative experience that is inseparable from mechanical mastery. That's fucking genius. It also helps that these games are just really fun, you know, that's always nice. However, games like these, that leverage the intrinsic incentive of embodying the character, should ideally be accompanied by extrinsic incentive structures that coincidentally push the player towards that end. And this can be a tricky thing to get right in many regards, especially when you start introducing new, differently characterized characters that are meant to share the incentives of the originals. But framing, something as simple as how big you make your fucking star, can make a world of difference. What separates your Dantes from your Bayos, your Violas from your Chais? Mechanical storytelling, man, it's cool. The true value of this kind of game, of course, only really lends itself to those who appreciate difficulty or mastery. The kind of player that sinks their teeth into mechanics and tries to get as good as possible. The kind of player who revels in playing through content again because they know there's more to achieve. But for those who are inclined to that sort of experience, it's not just that these games were made for you from a gameplay perspective, but these characters, these stories were written for you. To close off, I'm gonna make an analogy for why I think this type of characterization is special. I'd say these games are like instruments. Anyone can pick them up and make noise with them, but it takes someone with skill, understanding, discipline, and a drive to realize an ideal to produce anything worthwhile from them. Whereas a lot of games like Mario, have some level of auto-tune, as it were. They take precautions to ensure that the player will be aligned with the character they're playing, that the quality of their ludonarrative or their visual output won't be too negatively affected by the player's input. as long as they're playing well enough. Again, this isn't worse, in many ways it's better, and the music produced at the end of the day may be just as sweet regardless, but I don't know, man, there's just something special about playing an instrument. So, I guess to sum it all up, Sonic Advance 3 is pretty based. Dante is a virgin, play Hi-Fi Rush, and Bayonetta isn't dead. I got a pure platinum for that fight. She didn't get hit once. No, she did not get one shot by Gamora. I had the Conqueror's Reigns equipped. That's cheating. Read the item description. That doesn't work. She's not dead. You lie. You're a liar. Stop fucking lying to me!